Please welcome to the stage Inflation Insights founder and president, Omair Sharif, with Bloomberg Odd Lots co-hosts Tracy Alloway and Joe Weisenthal for a live podcast recording.
So these are the people who don't care about celebrities, right? The real celebrity is CPI.
We are the co-hosts of the Odd Lots podcast, here with Omair Sharif of Inflation Insights. Omair is one of our favorite economists that we speak to regularly on our podcast, where we typically cover like markets, finance, and economic stuff.
That's right. And today we're going to try to join the two worlds of entertainment and Hollywood with more of the macroeconomic stuff that we do on a day-to-day basis.
Right. So obviously one of the big macro stories here is the ongoing strikes. We got the news last night. The actors are continuing the strikes, despite the fact that, maybe it was expected to wrap up sooner. There's also more strike activity nationally. We also found out yesterday Ford expanding its strike. So we're going to try to balance out the two stories, talk about what we've learned so far from the economic impact here locally in LA and Southern California, and what that might say for the rest of the country.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right, Omair, thank you so much for coming here and making the time and chatting with us.
Yeah, nice to be back again.
Absolutely. So let's just start with like a basic question, which is this, the two strikes, one just wrapped up. Is it showing up just simply like, is it showing up yet in economic data?
Yeah, so, we have some national reports we can look at that show some of the impact of at least the writer's strike. There's some data out there right now in terms of work stoppages. So any strike that's more than 1,000 people gets recorded by the government, and some of that data started to show that, about 11,500 writers were on strike beginning in the June number. So we have seen it over the months, and we've now started to see that impact in the same work stoppages report, for example, showing 160,000 actors on strike as well. And of course, it records a whole lot of other strikes as well. So that's probably the main place where we see it. We haven't really seen it quite as much in terms of unemployment just yet. And there's few reasons for that. You can imagine, especially with the actors' strike, actors also tend to work other jobs, right? There's very few full-time actors. And so if they're working other jobs and they're making money, they won't be counted as unemployed. And in fact, in one of the surveys, the household survey, depending on how you answer the question about, whether you have a job, were you at your job, are you available to work, there's sort of a list of questions you have to answer. And in order to be counted as unemployed, you sort of have to hit all three of these questions perfectly. So unless people answer it in a certain manner, they will not be counted as being unemployed. The one area also within the household survey where you do see the impact is, the number of people who have a job but who are not at work due to a labor dispute. So that is a very, very specific category that they do capture in the BLS, and that is starting to show some of the impact right now. But more broadly, we haven't really seen a big increase, for example, in jobless claims. We haven't seen a huge move higher in the unemployment rate data itself, whether that's nationally or even really within LA or California.
Wait, can I ask a very basic question? Maybe it's a stupid question, but is strike action, what does the literature tell us about whether strike action is inflationary or deflationary? Because I could see you could possibly argue it both ways. So if it impacts output, then maybe prices go up because supply of a given thing is in shortage. And of course, if it's successful, then presumably wages for some workers go up. But on the other hand, if things aren't getting done, if things aren't getting made, then you would assume that's a hit to economic activity. Maybe people aren't getting paid, so maybe it's deflationary in that way.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about sort of the strike activity is it typically tends to follow inflationary periods. So it's not that the strike itself isn't causing prices to move higher. Right. It's that there may have been shocks, like, so for example, the oil shock, now the last couple of years with COVID, that caused prices to shoot up, workers fall behind, and then eventually that leads to more and more strike activity. So that's the first thing. I would say that it really tends to follow big price increases. The question of whether then eventually the pay raises you get afterwards, typically you don't see that as much in the inflation data. I think this time certainly could be different, given, we've got strikes on multiple fronts, and I think the auto sector is the most obvious answer. But that's partly because we're still recovering from a lot of the supply chain issues that, you guys have talked about on the show many, many times. So when you think about autos, for example, auto production has only just in the last 6-7 months gotten back to where it used to be before COVID. So to get a hit now to production is potentially someplace where you could see inflation pop up for new cars, for used cars, and other places. But typically you don't see as much of that happen post the resolution of the strike.
Right. Okay, well, on this note, I realize we are at an industry conference, so I won't ask you to opine on whether or not that writers and the actors' strikes are justified, but walk us through what the actual data tells us about wages for this particular subsector of worker.
Yeah, when I started digging into this, I was actually very surprised to find out some of these numbers. And I think in part because when, I remember hearing about the actors' strike initially, and I just remember thinking, well, you know what, I think Tom Cruise is going to be fine without a few months of pay, right? But what you generally don't tend to think about is all the other thousands upon thousands of actors who are not, the A-list celebrities who are in the magazines and so on. And so I started to look through the wage data, and I said, how much do actors actually make? So, for those of you who can see this chart, the top chart is just showing you a very specific industry, right? So this is the motion picture and video industry. This is where you'll find actors, but also everything from, folks who work in lighting to editing and so on.
So the actors are way down there.
They're way down
the
there.
Lawyers are
They
top.
are, they're just below data entry. Amusement park workers and so on, and they make about, $16.70, and that's the median. So half of them make more than that, half make less than that. But $16.70 is where they fit in. Yeah, number one, you would not be surprised, you're not going to be surprised, is lawyers in the motion picture industry. But actors are way down. They're in the bottom 20% of all workers when it comes to wages in the motion picture and video industry. And, another chart I wanted to look at was to say, okay, well, if this is the median, how much do people at the bottom end make versus the top end? And, the second chart down there shows you actually the green bars are the U.S. as a whole, so all actors across the United States, and the red is specifically for the L.A., Long Beach, Anaheim area. So that's a local look. And you can see locally the median is actually only about $15.70 for the LA area, so below the $16.70 we see for the industry as a whole. But look at how little variation there is at the bottom end, right? Like if you go towards the bottom 10%, you're still only at about $15.60. So only about a 10-cent difference between the bottom 10% and the middle. Even at the 75th percentile, you only move up to about $16.70, only about $1 more per hour. Fast forward to the 90th percentile, now you're up into the 70s. And for the US as a whole, you're up to over $110. So you really, if you're an actor, essentially, unless you are in that top 10%, and quite honestly, probably that top 1%, your median wage is probably going to be around that $15 to $16 range, whether that's a local number or whether it's national as a whole.
So I meant to say this in the industry, or in the introduction. One of the reasons we love talking to Omair is the level of data that he
comes equipped with the numbers.
Tracy once wrote an amazing article about mayonnaise inflation, and Omair knew all the different categories within. He's like, well, you might want to look at the fats and oils section of the producer price index, and then the PCE. It's mayonnaise is captured here. One of the things, and you mentioned it, that many actors have other jobs. So even if they're striking, they're not necessarily going to be counted as unemployed. And looking at these wages, I imagine that these other jobs that they could pick up, service industry jobs, pay pretty close. They're probably not taking a big economic hit.
Yeah, that's right. So, here I wanted to take a look at some of these other areas where you would see, again, as I mentioned, very few actors are full-time actors, right? It's part-time, you're taking other jobs. And so I took a look at sort of some of, just picked out randomly some of the areas where you see actors tend to work. And so you'll find places like, occupations like, bartenders, servers, real estate agents is a very popular one in LA at least. And so here you can see, this is local. These numbers are for local, for LA County. And so, again, the actors, $15.70 an hour. Servers are about $15.15 an hour, roughly. Bartenders, a little bit above that, about $15.35. Substitute teachers, $23 an hour. Real estate agents, around $31. So, that's why kind of the median is as low as it is because some of the other occupations here are, whether it's bartending or working at a restaurant, also tend to be on that lower end of the overall spectrum. So that's partly why you're seeing that number be so low. But again, I think when you look at that distribution, unless you are in that top 10%, the bottom 90 is going to be about $15 to $16 an hour, which tells you just how tough it is to kind of make it in that industry because it's not like if you're in the middle, you're making $15, $20 more than if you were at the bottom end. There's basically no difference.
There's the bottom and the top, and most people are on the bottom.
Yes,
that's my takeaway from your charts. Tracy, did you knew I used to be a substitute teacher, right?
Yes, I was aware of this. Were you also a struggling actor?
I was never, actually, kind of, but no. Just see, I had to give a shout out to the substitute teachers as a former sub here.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. So one thing. Actually, going to Joe's point about mayonnaise and all the different data sets that you can look up, one of the things I learned about inflation statistics doing that article was that there are these qualitative adjustments that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does on these numbers where they will look at probably not mayonnaise, but they'll look at something like a refrigerator and say, well, a modern refrigerator is so much better than a fridge from 1985. It can do so many more things, and so we have to adjust the inflation calculation. I always wondered, for something like movies or TV, can they do the same type of qualitative adjustment? How would you actually measure that?
Yeah, to the best of my knowledge, they don't do anything. Services in general tend to be very, very difficult to quality adjust. Some exceptions can be things like your cell phone service where, your wireless plan, you get a certain amount of data through it. If that data increases or decreases, they can sort of measure what that would, quote unquote, cost. For movies, though, I think it's as far as I know, they don't do anything with that. And in general, services activities are very tough to do. So they really try to stick with goods, as you mentioned, like, televisions, refrigerators, cars. The new model your car comes out, it's got more bells and whistles than the last one. They can look at how much the manufacturer spent on adding, better technology to that vehicle and sort of remove that from the price to say, hey, this is the quality adjustment. Services, though, it's very difficult to do.
Okay, so the BLS isn't watching all the new movies and going, wow, these special effects are so much better, we need to adjust our inflation methodology.
It's a good question. I will ask them when I get back to work tomorrow. But
this is the other thing we've learned, by the way, is that the BLS is great. You can call them up and just ask a question about the economic data, and they'll walk you through it.
They're happy to chat about it all the time.
As we are. You mentioned, so unemployment not really showing up in the data. Are there any other sort of like statistics in the regional economy where you can see some effect from work stoppages or certain types of sectors? I mean, I have to imagine, obviously the not shooting affects more than actors, it affects makeup people, affects other production people. Are there other areas or other data sets you can look at to see how the strike is having an impact or percolating up there?
Yeah, so actually, if you look at industry employment numbers, right? Yeah. So specifically here for California, and you can look at, for example, sort of the film and TV industry, and you can tack on also, there's another industry that captures independent writers and performers. So if you kind of combine those two big industries and say what's going on in the job growth in those two sectors in California, since April, so the strike started early May, the writer strike at least, since April, combined they've lost about 17,000 jobs. And most of that has been in the motion picture industry, less so on the independent writer side. But it is clear there that you're seeing some impact in terms of layoffs that are happening. So that's one area. But the second area also is that activity in general in the industry has been contracting probably for the last year and a half. So, I'm not going to, you mentioned earlier about are the strikes justified or not. I don't know if I want to go down into that rabbit hole, but what I will say is that in general, I really like the way Ellen Stutzman, who was the chief negotiator for the Writers Guild, they're criticizing the writers about striking at a time when things are tough for the streaming services and so on. And she said, look, our job is to ensure that our guild members have good jobs and share in, the value that we create as writers, regardless of whatever it is that the industry is doing. And what the industry has been doing in terms of film and TV is, and this, you mentioned shoot days earlier, so this is a good number to look at. From 2015 to 2019, before COVID hit, the average number of shoot days in California every quarter was about 9,500 shoot days. So this is
real quick question: who tracks the shoot?
Yeah.
So this is Film LA.
Okay.
You can Google them. You can find these numbers. They're all available publicly.
Okay.
And so if you want to get a permit to shoot a commercial, a TV show, whatever, you go through Film LA. So they can track who's shooting, how often, how many days, and all that. So typically, on average, in a quarter, prior to COVID, it was about 9,500 days. Obviously, COVID, nothing happened. It went to zero. But by the middle of 2021, we were back to about 10,000 days of shooting. Since the end of 2021, so this is about the last 5 quarters before the strike began, shoot days have fallen every single quarter. As of Q1 of this year, shoot days were 20% below the 5-year average from 2015 to 2019. So, even before the actor strike started in July and the writer strike started in May, activity had been sort of on a pretty steady downtrend for almost, just over a year, really. So there you can see that, things were already kind of difficult for the industry as a whole before the strikes began. And so that's one area where you can see it clearly. You can see the employment numbers as well. But interestingly, as we've talked about, because writers can work other jobs, you don't see it, for example, in the jobless claims data. You haven't seen such a big spike overall. You don't see the unemployment rate in California moving. So in April, it was 4.5%. Now it's 4.6%. The one thing I would caution is we only have data for California through the month of August. So it's only been about a month since, the actor strike started. So it might just be a matter of time before we start to see it over the next couple of months. But on the actor side, it might just be a little too early to really say.
This was going to be my next question. I'm getting the sense that there is a lag involved here, partly because people do have more than one job, or actors typically have more than one job. How do you kind of gauge how long that lag might take until you start seeing more of a stark impact on the numbers?
So I guess what I would say is if I wanted to try to, so I don't know exactly what that lag would be, but I think if I wanted to try to track, when is this starting to show up, I would be most closely watching the weekly data on unemployment claims, because that's where you would expect, especially, granular digging down into LA, what's happening in LA County. Partly because the workforce here in that industry is roughly, I think, about 3.5% of all jobs in LA are either in that industry or, in that independent performers. So those two areas you want to watch, and if you start to see it happening in LA, I think it'll be obvious with the jobless claims data when that starts to show up. But again, it's tough to say because people can transition from acting into, other areas as well, in terms of those part-time jobs that we talked about.
So you mentioned earlier that you have to answer 3 questions in order to be counted as unemployed. Do you know what those questions are, out of curiosity?
I knew this was going to come up. I should have memorized these. So one of them is, do you currently have a job? And if so the answer would have to be no. Are you available and looking for work? Would also have to be no, and the third one I'm blanking on right now, but I will get back to you on it.
Okay.
Right, 2 out of 3 is pretty good.
Yeah, that was pretty impressive. By the way, just in case at some point there might be a QR code behind us, so if you have any questions and you want to submit them, and if the QR code comes up, there it is. Scan the QR code using your phone camera, and you can submit a question. And we have some time, so definitely appreciate any audience questions. I want to go back to a bigger picture thing you said, which I think is really important, which is that historically strikes are not the catalyst for the inflationary period, but come after them. And of course that makes sense. People feel that they're falling behind. People want to get their share, and there's this whole idea of inflation in general is often a battle over a result of different competing claims on money. Can you talk a little bit about the big picture, like historical trends of what we see? I know that like strike activity has picked up a little bit, but it's nothing like what it used to be. Like, talk to us a little bit more about that theory of labor tension strikes as a sort of post-inflation phenomenon.
Yeah, so I think, so obviously there's been a ton of attention on unions and strikes the last year or so. What's interesting is if you actually look at the percentage of workers in the private sector who are part of a union, in 2012 it was around 6.5%. It's actually down to 6% now, which is not something you would necessarily know.
Wait, sorry, what was the?
So these are people who are in a union.
Yeah.
Employees who are in a union in terms of all private sector employment.
Okay.
So out of everyone who's working in the private sector, only about 6.5% of people were part of a union.
Got it.
10 years ago.
Okay.
And now that share has gone down to 6%. So even though they're getting a lot more attention, that share of folks who are in a union has actually gone down. The number of people who are currently on strike is about 210,000, roughly. That's not even as high as it was several years back.
Wow.
It's nowhere near the several, 500,000, 600,000, 700,000 in the 80s. We could potentially, by the way, get there. There's, the possibility that these 75,000 healthcare workers at Kaiser might strike.
Right.
Obviously, the UAW is not completely striking. That's 140,000 people right now. That I think only about 15,000, 20,000 of them are on strike. So we could potentially get to a number that's been the highest since the early 80s. But I think part of what's going on there is one, I think given what's gone on through the pandemic, obviously there have been a lot of changes in the labor market in general. Everything from work from home, but also during that period, a lot of workers, frontline workers especially, continue to work, and companies did extremely well in terms of profits. And so a lot of these folks are coming back now and saying, we ought to be sharing in some of that record profit growth that we've seen over the last several years. And you can sort of see this in terms of opinions about unions, which used to be much more negative. They're enjoying, some of the best support they've had in decades from the general public, if you will. So that's one part of it. Also, I think the other element here is that when you think about some of the industries where we're seeing strike activity, they are undergoing, transformational changes, right? When you think about writers and actors, yes, of course, it's about better pay and about residuals, but it's also about the use of AI.
Right.
And people want to figure out how is that going to impact me down the road. In the auto workers strike, yes, about better pay and pensions and benefits. Also about EVs. How are the change to electric vehicles going to impact workers? So a lot of these places are seeing transformational changes that are coming, and workers are trying to figure out how exactly they can sort of protect themselves in that sort of environment. So yes, there's been a lot of activity. I think the profit story is big. I think obviously inflation is a huge, huge part of that story. For a couple of years, real wages were declining very, very sharply. If you actually look at auto workers, for example, you go back to 2008, they took a lot of cuts to help the industry survive after 2008. And if you look at their real wages since then, they're still down about 10%. So they're asking to sort of, be made whole and then some at this point, given, excuse me, the profits that we've seen at the auto workers.
Yeah, they also created that sort of tiered system for auto
Yep.
workers. Okay, so some common themes running through the Hollywood strikes and the auto workers strikes, such as, obviously inflation's been picking up, real wages going down, transformational change that is this big question mark for the respective industries as a whole. But how much of a read-through can we get from the actor and writers strikes and the economic impact so far to the UAW? Because as you point out, it feels like the situation of someone who's making cars versus someone who's writing scripts or is a part-time actor, it feels different.
Yeah, so, look, I think you can't even get a read-through from the writer's strike to the actor's strike, let alone to the UAW. I think what I would say in general, the underlying theme has been, so far this year and parts of last year, you've seen some unions, even if they didn't necessarily strike, win some really big concessions, right? So think about UPS and the Teamsters.
Right.
They threatened to strike, ended up not striking, but they won some really big gains for their workers. The pilots didn't strike, but United, Delta ended up with 40% raises over the next 4 years. So you've seen these unions sort of rack up win after win after win. Really big unions rack up these wins. The writers is one element where 5 months ago, people were wondering what could they actually get out of this, and they got a fair bit of what they wanted out of it. But it's tough because now, as you know from yesterday, the negotiations are off right now on the actor side of things. So it's tough to get a real read-through, even within the same industry. But I would say so far, I think union after union is inspiring the next union to take on the challenge because they have racked up a lot of wins this year. UAW is also a little bit different in the sense that the way they're striking is targeted, right? So it's a very different approach than what the writers did, different approach than what the actors are doing as well. So it's hard to say if we can really take what happened with the writers and the resolution on the writers' strike and say that there's something there to learn with respect to the UAW other than, hey, these guys also got to win. We should continue to kind of fight.
So there's an audience question. You mentioned that even prior to the strike, that the number of shoot days in the area had been trending down. I think you said for 5 straight quarters. How significant just is like the health of the entertainment industry for California?
Well, if you look at shoot days, it's not going great.
Right.
Those being down 20% versus what we were doing in 5 years prior to COVID is a pretty significant. And by the way, that does not include the second quarter, which is when the writers' strike began. So
right.
After
so
the
that's going to plunge.
Yeah, it's going to plunge, and we don't even have the data yet for after the actor strike. Right, that's going to essentially plummet. But even by the second quarter, after the writers' strike began in May, so you only really had 1 month, April, where you probably were shooting. We were down to about 6,500 days, which is the lowest since prior to 2015. So you're seeing in general a year and a half of an industry that's been struggling. And I know throughout the day people have talked about streaming and how the challenge is there. So I would say that the industry has been, especially when you think about shoot days also, they've been losing shoot days, especially in commercials. If you think about commercials for anything from like shooting a car commercial or so on, they're losing business to places like Georgia. Georgia's got something like about $1 billion in tax credit that they gave out last year.
Wow.
And so that's, they're losing commercials to other parts of the country. Shows are also being shot elsewhere. So there's been a steady sort of, I don't necessarily want to say exodus, but some, folks who are
erosion.
Erosion's a better way to put it. So, there's definitely a struggle going on right now, I think, more broadly speaking, for the industry.
You mentioned this idea of maybe some of the hot union summer that we've seen is being caused by people looking at the wins from other labor organizations and thinking like, well, maybe now is our chance. And of course, you also mentioned that a lot of strike activity tends to follow on after periods of high inflation for obvious reasons. What would be the catalyst for some of these wage pressures to die down, I guess? Like, if we started to see a lot of pushback, if inflation started to come down and maybe real wages stabilized, would you expect to see some of this activity go away? Or what does history tell us about like the end of these surges in strike activity?
Yeah, so I don't know that inflation coming down would necessarily solve the problem, partly because a lot of these contracts, for example, tend to be 3-4 years long. And so what you're negotiating for now is to try to get back what you've lost over the last 3 years. So inflation comes down from 9% last year to 3% this year. That's great for hopefully locking in a win now over the course of the next several years. But you're still trying to play catch up to the last few years. So I don't know that would necessarily do it. I think, the two things typically tend to be, one, if it's an industry where public opinion will turn against you very quickly. So I could see a situation, for example, where, if the auto stuff drags on for a long time, the inevitable thing that's going to happen is car prices will skyrocket, much more so than they have even in the last year or 2 years. And that's going to cause, I would suspect, that's going to cause problems and tensions with the broader public, right? So I think that's one potential danger.
This is an area, in other words, as you said earlier, we're in an era where surveys showed that unions enjoy relatively high support versus, say, several years ago. And if car prices start to spike, that could start to shift.
You know, it's all well and good when the enemy is like corporate greed.
Yes.
Right? When it starts to hit you at home, that becomes a different story, and people tend to change their tune pretty quickly. So that's one potential danger there is if sort of the public turns against you. But the other issue also would be, you know, to some extent, there's a certain, as you know, all these unions have a certain amount of money where they help to provide for people who are striking. So the UAW, for example, is giving out, you know, $500 a week. At some point, you know, to the extent those funds run dry, and it really starts to become very painful for the workers at some point, that's another sort of element that could, you know, lead to a quicker resolution, if you will.
This seems like a distinct difference between the Hollywood strikes and the writer strikes, where I can't imagine the auto workers are just like picking up shifts at restaurants and bars at the same wages. They are the same way actors often can.
Yeah, I think it's a very different dynamic. So another reason it's hard to read through between them. Actors, like I said, it just hasn't shown up in the claims data because they're able to shift into these other sectors.
You know, there's a question, and I don't know, I wish I even knew this. Someone is asking other areas within Hollywood that, or within entertainment that could strike. Do you know, like, are there other risks of further contagion? Like, I wish I had a better understanding of whether there are like other union guild contracts, but is there still risk of contagion within the local economy here?
So prior to all of this, there was it's resolved because it never went on strike, but there was a directors guild issue, but that was resolved. The one that I have read about more recently is voice actors. So voice actors, I mean, they are part of SAG-AFTRA, so they can't work, for example, on a full-length, you know, animation feature, but they can still work on voiceovers for like commercials and things like that. But there was some talk about you know, some others who are not covered under these contracts to potentially also strike. Something similar in terms of like the video game industry as well. So there's some elements there of, you know, some spillover, but I don't think those areas are quite as large as what we're talking about with respect to the actors part of it.
You know, this is slightly off topic, perhaps, but not really. So the other event that happened last night, obviously the second tier event compared to the opening evening of Bloomberg Screen Time, was Taylor Swift and her red carpet premiere for the Eras Tour. And there's been so much discussion recently about this idea that Taylor Swift is propping up the U.S. economy, injecting billions of dollars worth of demand at a time when we might otherwise see some softening. What do you think about the Swift effect, the new Taylor rule?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's pretty real when you look at the data, right? So we were talking about this earlier, but if you look, for example, where she has gone on tour at certain points, you will see a spike in hotel rates everywhere she goes. So a good example of this is a couple of months ago, we saw data she was, I think, touring the Midwest, and it was like June or July. Excuse me. And prices prior to that shot up 55% for hotel rates. As soon as she left the next month, they were down 20%.
Wow.
So, you know, there's pretty clear that there's an impact happening. People are traveling from all over for the shows. And Beyonce also, you know, right? Actually, I think, you know, Anna Wong at Bloomberg has actually written a lot about this, and I think there's a lot of good, interesting data she's put out about it. But yeah, I think it's very real. Even the Philadelphia Fed, I believe, at one point said she impacted the local economy in the Beige Book.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's pretty clear there's a Taylor effect happening.
Is it at the level where you, as an inflation analyst, have to pay attention to Taylor Swift tour dates?
I never thought I would have to, but yes, like I said, this hotel rate stuff was shocking because this is one of those things within the inflation index that is extremely volatile. So month to month, it can destroy your forecast, and it destroyed mine this morning. But it can move around 5%, 7% in a month. And like I said, last month it was down massively, and I couldn't figure out why, and I started digging into the weeds, and next thing I know, I see this massive decline in the Midwest. And sure enough, the few months prior to that, when she was touring around the region, you had just seen this huge surge, and as soon as she was gone, you saw hotel rates come down. So there's some element of, her impact on different data sets, including the inflation index for hotel rates, that I think is pretty obvious. And again, I never thought I would have to worry about this kind of stuff, but it's in the data, so you've got to kind of be aware of it.
Well, as you mentioned, so we are, what is today, October 12th, I think?
I think that's right.
Regardless, is CPI day, which is like a holiday for you. And so we really appreciate you spending your CPI day with us talking about the entertainment industry. But since we have you on CPI day, and the numbers came in a little bit hot, but at least on the headline, others were saying, if you look at like core services, X housing is actually kind of cool. What should we take from the inflation trajectory right now?
So, we've had the summer of disinflation, right? We had 4 or 5 months where the numbers were retreating, and they would look like they used to look prior to COVID, and things were improving to the point where Fed officials were saying, hey, maybe we don't need to raise rates as much anymore. The last 2 months, we've had a little bit of a pop here to slightly higher numbers. We're not going back to those 2021 type days or early 2022 when every month we were getting numbers that were running, 6-7% annualized. But right now we're around 3.5% annualized, which is still too high for the Fed. The problem is over the next quarter, 3.5 is about where we're going to be sitting, I think. And so, the problem is going to be that you're hoping to get down to 2% on inflation. What looked like a trajectory that was going to get you there over the summer has now shifted higher. And I think we also have to be a little bit careful here because CPI is absolutely going to shift higher over the next month or two. The core PCE deflator is obviously what the Fed prefers to watch. That looks like it will shift a little bit higher, but probably not as much as what's going to happen in the CPI for some reasons in terms of how they're constructed differently. So we're going to have to watch that one more closely. But the problem for the Fed, I think, is when they meet in December, they're going to walk into that meeting. A lot of people think we don't need to raise rates anymore. We're done. What they're going to confront is a August, September, very likely October and November CPI that are all running at about a 3.5% annualized rate. And you mentioned the super core, which is core services outside of housing. So these are a lot of different things: hotel rates, airfares, what you pay to go to the movies, what you might pay to go to a sporting event. Those sorts of prices were up today at a 7% annualized rate. And the concern, I think, is in December it's going to be suddenly this path has shifted higher. So do they think that they need to do maybe do one more rate hike, which, by the way, 12 out of 19 of them thought was the right move in September? It's going to be tough for them to, I think, if you're data dependent and the data shifted higher, it's going to be tough to sort of forego another hike in December. So I think that's the concern for me is, are they going to be able to sort of parse through this and say, hey, we should go one more time? Or are they going to look at it and say, we know some of these things will cool off next year, so we can kind of hold our fire right now?
Maybe they need to ask Taylor Swift if she's going to extend her tour or not.
See, I always thought that Taylor Swift tour would be deflationary because it's all these sort of like, people with like, middle-class families transferring money to someone who has more money than God, who is not going to spend
and she's
it.
Not spending it all?
Transfer of money to someone with a much lower marginal propensity to consume. But but apparently in the short term,
spending it on airfares to get to the show, to the cab, and
right.
So everything except the ticket purchase, I guess, would be inflationary.
Yeah, and I will say one of the things about the strike too. By the way, there's going to be a lot of numbers that come out. A recent one from the Milken Institute said the economy is going to take a $5 billion hit from the actors and the writers strike. And actually, they also said there was a $2 billion hit in 07-08. The thing, though, is for a lot of people is like, let's say the movies don't come out, or new shows are not coming out. If you're somebody, you live in wherever, in LA, Manhattan, Brooklyn, and you go to the movies often, and these movies are delayed now, that money can get spent elsewhere, right? Like we know that from COVID, right? When people were stuck at home, they couldn't go out to the restaurants or the bars. What do? They just bought every sofa and lamp they could buy, and they
remodeled.
And they continue to do that for like 2 years. So it's not, if you're living in New York and you can't go see a movie because the movie's out, you can go check out a new band at the Mercury Lounge. There's a lot of other things to do. So that money can get spent elsewhere and kind of limit the impact of the strike. And in fact, if you look at, sort of some of the lost wages we've seen so far for actors, for writers, it's a problem for the LA region. You're talking about potentially as much as a 2% hit to GDP, I think, for annualized for LA, if this goes on for the rest of the year. But when you broaden out to California, this is a $3.7 trillion economy, right? Now you're talking about maybe a tenth. You go out to the U.S., it's a $24 trillion, $25 trillion economy. It's virtually close to zero. But like I said, even though people may not be able to spend as much on the movies and sort of associated things, that spending we know can shift elsewhere and kind of limit that damage to some extent.
I feel like I need to spell out for Odd Lots listeners that Go See a New Band at the Mercury Lounge was in fact a reference to Joe's band and their first show at the Mercury Lounge in December. And in terms of inflation, I just want to add, Joe is making me buy my own tickets. I don't even get comped the $20 for this.
No,
I have to buy them.
we're trying to do our part for the lag. If you're in New York City, December 19th, come out to see Light Sweet Crude at the Mercury Lounge. Omair Sharif, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you so much to the audience coming to the studio stage as we combine the Odd Lots and Screen Time. And thank you so much for coming to the Screen Time conference. And I think that's it.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of the event. I think there are drinks outside, and we'll see you there.
Yeah, thank you so much.